On my video today, I'm going to talk to you about Peter Frankopan's The Earth Transformed, an Untold Story. And this is a history book, a global history book that can really help you because it gives you the story arcs of humanity and humanity's relationship to the environment, to planet Earth, to climate change. Not just climate change, but also diseases and volcanoes and all sorts of things. If you've ever wondered how to make sense of the big story of what's going on with the environment, what's going on with climate change, Peter Frankopan's The Earth Transformed is essential reading. It's only been published this year. I only picked it up about 2 weeks ago and read it. It's a brilliant book. I highly recommend it to you. Let me tell you all about it. So it's a brilliant book. Peter Frankopan is an English historian, the professor of global history at Oxford University. He's written two great books, Silk Roads and The New Silk Roads, that I've reviewed on the channel. And this book, The Earth Transformed, is an enormous and utterly stunning achievement that brings together a global perspective, literally a global perspective, not just every place in the world, but the dynamics of how the geology and the biology and the climate and the various living beings on the world all have interacted over history and led us to be in the potentially near catastrophic situation we are in today in terms of the environment and climate and everything. And he does that by bringing also together new science and kinds of evidence that you perhaps have never really seen in a history book before. All sorts of astonishing things about scientific data and that offer new insights, not just to the science, but also to different historical periods. And he also, in a totally masterly, but also, very accessible sort of way, holds together all these different threads of climate change and geology and global history and the different parts of the world and interactions between technology and migration and language. And it's an absolutely astonishing history. In a way, it's a rewritten history of the world with a focus not just on the people of the West, but the people of the world and how the people of the world fit in to the environment of the world. So really could not recommend this book higher to anyone. And at the start of the book, Peter Frankopan sets out his goals of the book, and I'll just read to you what they are. So he says his first goal is to reinsert climate back into the story of the past as an underlying, crucial and much overlooked theme in global history, and to show where, when and how whether long-run climate patterns and changes in climate, anthropogenic, that is, man-made or human-made, and otherwise, have had an important impact on the world. His second goal is to set out the story of human interaction with the natural world over millennia, and to look at it in thousands of years, and to look at how our species exploited, moulded and bent the environment to its will, both for good and for ill. And his third goal of the book is to expand the horizons of how we look at history. Study of the past has been dominated by the attention paid to the global north, that is the wealthy societies of Europe and North America, with the history of other continents and other regions often relegated to secondary significance or ignored entirely. And the same pattern applies to climate science and research into climate history, where there are vast regions, periods, and peoples that receive little attention, investigation, or investment. And he brilliantly achieves all three of those aims. As I said, he has that global perspective. He has that integration of all sorts of new kind of scientific information. And he also holds together all these different threads of integrating climate history, or the history of the environment, if you like, with the human interaction with that environment. The book itself is organised into 24 chapters. It's quite a long book. It's about roughly 650 pages. And there are also 200 odd pages of footnotes that it's not included in the published book, but you sort of download from the internet. Probably saving his publisher a lot of money, I suspect. And the kind of story arc of that outline really begins with the world from the dawn of time, 4 to 5 billion years ago, going through to the origin of our species, human interactions with ecologies, the growth of cities and trade networks around about 3,500 to 2,500 BC. And then he goes through many familiar periods, I guess, like, Babylonian or whatever civilization, and Rome and medieval period and all that kind of thing, but really with a different sort of narrative that looks all around the world and also links that story to the nature of the environment and human interaction with the environment. He talks about the steppe frontier, the Roman warm period, which is a key climactic event. So he sort of almost retells the history of the world with a timeline that's related to the big climactic and environmental events of the world. The crisis of late antiquity, around about 500 to 600 BC. The medieval warm period, which is around 900 to 1250. Then he talks about the changes in the disease environment in the world, and this is another one of the strands that he brings together in the book. 1250 to 450, the disease environment and the formation of the New World, the expansion of ecological horizons and the fusion of the old and new worlds, his replacement term, I guess, for the Columbian Exchange. And that's an absolutely fascinating chapter, the whole, Americas and everything. The exploitations of nature and people, looks at the transatlantic slave trade, but also the sort of resource exploitation of primarily by the Euro-Atlantic powers. The Little Ice Age, and this is a very fascinating chapter that looks at the period 1550 to 1800. He explores the great divergence of Europe from the rest of the world, little and great divergences, the impact of industrialization in the 19th century and how it extracted resources and its impact on the natural world, the age of turbulence leading to World War I, 1920, the fashioning of new utopias, technological utopias of both left and right wing, like all capitalist and communist versions, both of which were catastrophic for the planet, for the environment, or for natural species, other natural species. The reshaping of the global environment, the sharpening of anxieties beginning in the 1960s, and then finally the discussion of being on the edge of ecological limits. So it's a fascinating outline narrative. There's kind of three real sort of standout elements of this book that, as I was reading it, I really admired, and I guess overall as well, as a writer, I tend to be fairly essayistic and whatnot, but the skill and the insight and the clarity of organisation that has gone into this book is really utterly stunning. When you think about it, it's a history of the entire planet's history and the interaction of all humanity, not just European or Western humanity, but all humanity and all biological and environmental and climactic events over a period of several billion years. So to actually even get that into a coherent and understandable book is astonishing. And similarly, one of the standout features is it's not just your kind of usual story and tales. It brings in all this extraordinary scientific evidence and does so without being heavy-handed or too difficult to understand. It's incredibly well and simply explained without being oversimplified. And I'm no scientist, so perhaps maybe it has been oversimplified. But he has an extremely balanced perspective on all this new scientific evidence. So what's an example? I mean, he looks, for example, at the period towards the end of the 18th century, like the 1780s, when there are a whole lot of kind of El Nino events, and explores in some depth the importance of the El Nino, El Nina phenomenon in the world climate. Now, we in Australia are very familiar with the El Nino, El Nina events. It very much defines our patterns of drought and flood in this country. But he points to a whole series of particularly significant and rapid El Nino, El Nina events, which apparently some scientists refer to as the mega Nino in the period around about the late 1780s and early 1790s. A period which precipitated a whole and fed into a whole lot of major historical events. The French Revolution, and the French Revolution was partly caused by food shortages, famine and bad harvests and that kind of thing. And it also feeds into a very parochial point here, of course, the early history of Australia, or white settlement in Australia, because the first 5 to 10 years of the colony in New South Wales was very touch and go as to whether it would survive. They really did not go. They almost starved to death, really. They had all sorts of difficulties, and this was in part because of these El Nino events that happened to be occurring at the same time. So there was a whole series of huge rainfall and other events in the 1780s, and these upheavals were soon followed in 1789 to 93 by what has been referred to as a mega Nino, an episode so strong that it has only occurred a handful of times in the last 2 millennia. Recent scholarship that draws on climatological records from the Western Pacific, where I live, suggests that the event was in fact a very strong La Nina event from 1788 to 1790, which flipped to a strong El Nino event that lasted from 1791 to 1794. This was a global reorganization of weather systems that had global consequences, some of them long-lasting, some dramatic and some both. So that's an example of how he brilliantly integrates all this sort of new scientific evidence into the more familiar storylines and some of the less familiar storylines of human history. And as I said, also the second standout feature of his approach to this book is the global perspective. This is not just your same old about, Western civilization and Europe. He gives the due to all other parts of the world. Even good old Australia gets a few mentions. And this relates both to his coverage, but also the way he looks at how things are all connected. It's all a seamless web, as one of my history lectures used to say, but he actually explains some of the interconnections between human interaction and climate across all different parts of the world. For example, he talks about the link between human migration across different parts of the world, languages, and changes in ecosystems. And he looks at some of the big events, like the big climactic events, like the Little Ice Age in 1600s roughly. Now, some people have looked at that Little Ice Age and focused very much on what was happening in Europe. But Peter Frankopan brilliantly looks at some of these big climactic events and looks at how they impacted different parts of the world differently, and how climactic events in one part of the world, I guess El Nino is an example, would have complex and unpredictable ripple effects around other parts of the world. So the global perspective on this book is absolutely magnificent. And if you are kind of looking for that kind of global history, this book, Earth Transformed, is a brilliant supplement, I guess, almost to his books on the New Silk Roads and all that sort of thing, by bringing together that genuinely global perspective, not just on places, but also on the links between humanity and other species, other aspects of the environment. And that's really the third aspect of how he does this. He holds all the different threads of the consequences of human interaction and the environment together brilliantly. Some of that is a very balanced discussion of anthropogenic climate change. Some of it is also looking at how, some aspects of climate change are way, or climactic events are way, way beyond human control. He discusses several enormous volcanic eruptions that have occurred over history that have had major impacts on the climate, but also on human history. One of those was the extraordinary explosion of Mount Tambora in what is now Indonesia in, I think, 1815, which led, amongst other things, to a a year without summer in Europe. I'd love at some point to find out what impact it had on Australia in 1815 and 1816, because after all, we're pretty damn close to Indonesia. And so he looks at volcanoes. He looks at climate change, and brilliantly at climate change, and I'll say a little bit more about that a little bit later, and has a very balanced perspective on both how the climate has fluctuated over time and many times fluctuated way beyond the kind of recent changes we've seen in recent times, but also how one of the distinctive things about the current period is it's a globally consistent sort of pattern of change, unlike some of those earlier times. But he also looks not just at climate change, but at other aspects. He looks at how other species, other than dear old humanities, had an impact on the environment. He looks at how climate and climactic events like volcanoes and things like that have an impact on disease pathogens, on insects and mosquitoes and malaria. He looks at the links between sort of geology, climate, plant life, animal life, and human life. It really is, utterly stunning achievement to do all of that with such clarity. So, I'm not aware really of anything else that quite as humanely and clearly and relevantly, I guess. He has a very practical way of putting all of that is very relatable, I think. So I also found that this book really settled my mind a bit on the whole sort of climate change, environment type debate. Certainly I've been aware of arguments over time that, yes, things, climate has changed recently, but there have been other periods in human history where, there was that little ice age and other periods where things changed as well. This isn't the only time the weather's gone south. But I had absolutely no idea how to evaluate those kind of different stories that you hear about the past of climate change, this different stories of the history of climate change and the environment. And Peter Frankopan's book, I think, does so in a very masterly way. He has a very balanced point of view. This is not a book full of doom. It has its dark moments, I guess, but it's not a doomy book. It talks about how there's good and bad for some of these things. And it's also not I guess it's not like a advocacy book. It's not a partisan book, either, for climate change agenda, or he has a very clear position, but he has a very balanced approach to the evidence. So whatever your incoming view about the whole climate change debate, you can actually learn a lot from this book. It's a great, it's a very open-minded, balanced, judicious book. So this is towards the end of the book where he says, he sort of reviews that the evidence that, the decade 2010 to 2020 was the warmest since modern record keeping began. And he says, what makes these so significant is that they are part of a globally coherent pattern of warming. As we have seen, while there have been many epochs in the past that have experienced particularly cold or warm periods, such as the Little Ice Age, the medieval climate anomaly, or the Roman warm period, These were not universal, but rather were particularly pronounced in one or more regions, even on one or more continents. In contrast, the last 150 years show near coherence all around the world. For 98% of the planet, the 20th century was the warmest period of the last 2 millennia. This is not only unprecedented, it is also not a coincidence. He then discusses how increased energy use, population levels, greater urbanisation, new production and transport technologies, and more commercial interaction have all been driving these impacts of change. And then he says, how human activities interact with, affect or mitigate natural changes in the climate is a matter of considerable discussion, primarily because of the technical difficulties of weighing up complex evidence and data. For example, the rapid warming of global surface temperatures was reported to have slowed down in the early part of the 21st century, with unusually low growth trends in surface and tropospheric temperatures, as well as those of upper ocean heat content and sea level, in what has become known as the global warming slowdown or hiatus. It is not only the reasons for this that are contested, so too is the premise, with the disagreement about whether that selection or measurement bias or both influenced conclusions, or even if changes in instrumentation might have distorted data. Despite the spillover from such discussions, which can convince those who want to be convinced that there is no anthropogenic impact on climate, a survey of almost 90,000 peer-reviewed climate-related papers published since 2012 suggests that the consensus about human-caused climate change among scientists working in this field exceeds 99%. So I found, there has been so much, he says, she says kind of stuff on climate and environment, and I'm no scientist. I have no idea how to assess the evidence. I found this remarkable book, incredibly grounding book in terms of understanding what's going on in the world, not just the human aspect of the world, but the physical, environmental world. The other feature of Peter Frankopan's book is he's a very practically minded historian. It's a great, if you're interested in the practicalities of what the hell to do about it, you can also learn a lot about this book. Not that he talks about solutions, but he certainly talks about the challenges of adaptation. What the hell are we going to do about it? And he is fairly sanguine about that, because he says, after all, one of the lessons of history is that humans do have a tendency to fail to adapt many, many times. And he ends his book with a, I guess, haunting, even harrowing conclusion. I don't really want to do any spoilers, but you can always turn to the end of the book in the bookshop. He says, it is easy to answer the question of how the problem of climate change is solved. It will be nature rather than human action that ultimately brings net emissions to zero, or towards zero. It will do so through catastrophic depopulation, whether through hunger, disease, or conflict, with fewer of us around to burn fuel, cut down forests, and tear minerals from the Earth's crust. The human footprint may become drastically reduced, and we will move closer to the sustainable, lush paradise of our fantasized past. Perhaps we will find our way back there through peaceful means. A historian would not bet on it. It's a wonderful book, a wonderful book. It's a very practical-minded book, I guess. His dominant framework, I guess, is science and, I guess, economics, sort of resource use, that sort of thing. He doesn't perhaps so much explore, although there's a little bit of it, the imaginative response of human interaction to the environment and to climate change. There is some. I mean, the great work by Filippo Fernandez Amesto, Civilizations, which I did a video on the channel, is perhaps another earlier version, less informed by scientific evidence and perhaps more informed by that imaginative human response to environments, that has some similarities and some differences to Peter Frankopan's work that you could also consult. You could check out my video on that as well. But thank you, Peter Frankopan, for writing an absolutely brilliant book, The Earth Transformed. And I really do recommend to all viewers of the Burning Archive YouTube channel to check it out, have a read, or check out Peter Frankopan's talks on the issue. But also look also at my video on Felipe Fernandez Amesto's book Civilizations, which explores how different human cultures have interacted with their environments in different ways, forming diverse and complex civilizations all across the globe, complex and successful civilizations. Let's hope we can keep doing it for a little bit longer yet before the catastrophic depopulation that Peter Frankopan warns of at the end of The Earth Transformed comes about. I'll see you in the next video.